It was late, just past 11 p.m. I'd gotten home from a long day at work and decided to wind down in my room with a movie. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and occasional rain spattered against the windows. I don't usually mind storms, but something about that night felt heavy. I couldn't put my finger on it. About halfway through the movie, I heard a faint noise from the kitchen downstairs. It wasn't loud, just a subtle thud, like something falling onto the countertop. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was the wind rattling something loose. But the longer I sat there, the more it gnawed at me. Reluctantly, I paused the movie and made my way downstairs. In the kitchen, everything seemed normal at first. Then I noticed the fruit bowl on the counter. One of the bananas was on the floor. Odd, but I figured it had just rolled out. I placed it back and checked the windows. Locked. Satisfied, I went back upstairs, dismissing the incident as nothing. I barely made it back to my room before I heard something else. This time, it was a distinct scraping sound. Metal against wood. My heart started racing. I froze, listening carefully. It was coming from the dining room. I crept down the stairs again, each step creaking under my weight, and peered into the room. The chairs around the dining table were slightly shifted, as if someone had bumped into them. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I whispered to myself, just the wind. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I searched every room downstairs, checking every window and door. Nothing was out of place. Everything was locked. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Back in my room, I locked my door and left the hallway light on. I tried to focus on the movie, but my mind kept wandering back to the noises. I decided to call it a night. Just as I turned off the TV, I heard the faintest creak, like a floorboard being stepped on. It was coming from upstairs. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. The attic entrance was in the hallway just outside my room, but I hadn't been up there in months. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I opened my bedroom door and shone the light into the hallway. It was empty. That's when I noticed it. The attic door was slightly ajar. I froze, trying to convince myself it had always been like that, but I knew it hadn't. I stared at the dark opening, the edges of the panel swinging faintly in the draft. I didn't want to check, but I had to. I inched closer, every step feeling like a mistake. Gripping the pull cord, I gave it a light tug. The ladder unfolded with a loud creak, sending shivers down my spine. I aimed my flashlight up into the attic, illuminating the dusty space. At first there was nothing, just old boxes and forgotten junk. Then I saw it, a handprint, a single smudged handprint on the dusty floorboards. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. My mind raced with possibilities. I didn't wait to find out what had left it. I ran back to my room, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the house. Sitting in my car, I called the police, trying to steady my trembling hands. When they arrived, they searched the house and found no one. But in the attic, they discovered something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of food wrappers, water bottles, and a sleeping bag tucked behind some boxes. Whoever had been up there had been living in my attic for who knows how long. I haven't been back to that house since. The thought of someone living above me, listening to me, watching me, still haunts me. I've moved to a new place, but some nights when the wind howls and the house creaks, I find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'm really alone. It was a quiet night in early October, and I was working the overnight shift at a small-town diner. It wasn't my usual gig. I normally work mornings, but a coworker had called in sick, and I agreed to fill in. Business was slow, as expected. By 11 p.m., the place was practically deserted except for an older man nursing a cup of coffee in the far corner. Outside, a light drizzle started turning into steady rain. I busied myself wiping down counters and restocking the sugar packets, trying to pass the time. It was just past midnight when I noticed headlights briefly sweep across the windows before a car pulled into the lot. A man got out wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap and made his way to the door. He entered without saying a word, shaking rain from his coat. He sat at the counter right in front of me, though the entire diner was empty. His face was pale, almost sickly, and there was something unsettling about his presence. I forced a smile and handed him a menu. He didn't even look at it. "Coffee," he said flatly. I nodded and poured him a cup. He stared into it for a long moment before taking a sip. Something about the way he held the cup struck me as strange. His hands were trembling, and his knuckles were scraped raw, with fresh cuts that hadn't fully clotted. I wanted to ask if he was okay, but his intense stare kept me quiet. The rain outside grew heavier, beating against the windows in rhythmic bursts. The man didn't speak again, and the air felt thick with tension. The older customer in the corner paid his bill and left without a word, leaving me alone with the man at the counter. Minutes passed in silence. I tried to busy myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Every time I glanced his way, his eyes darted back to his coffee. Then he broke the silence. "Do you believe in coincidences?" he asked, his voice low and uneven. I blinked, caught off guard. "I guess it depends," I replied hesitantly. "Why?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a damp piece of paper from his coat pocket and unfolded it. He placed it on the counter, sliding it toward me. At first, I thought it was a receipt, but as I looked closer, I realized it was a photograph, an old one, faded and creased. It showed a woman standing in front of what looked like a cabin in the woods. "She's gone," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I tried to find her. I thought I did, but I didn't. I didn't know how to respond." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. He laughed bitterly. "Sorry won't fix it." The lights flickered then, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The storm outside had gotten worse, with gusts of wind rattling the windows. The man didn't react to the lights or the thunder that rumbled overhead. He just stared at the photograph, his expression unreadable. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. "Do you need help?" I asked. "I can call someone." "No," he snapped, slamming his hand on the counter. The sound echoed through the empty diner, and my heart raced. He softened almost immediately, shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to scare you." I didn't say anything. My hand hovered near the phone under the counter. "I'll leave," he said, after a long pause. He stood abruptly, leaving a crumpled bill next to the untouched coffee. He didn't take the photograph. As he walked to the door, he stopped and turned back to me. "Lock the doors," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone else in tonight." Before I could respond, he stepped out into the storm and disappeared into the darkness. I locked the doors as he suggested, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. When my shift finally ended at dawn, I saw a news report on the TV in the corner of the diner. A woman's body had been found in the woods just outside of town. Her photo flashed on the screen. It was the same woman from the photograph he'd left behind. I was heading home after visiting a friend who lived about 40 minutes away in a rural area. It was close to midnight and the roads were eerily quiet. The highway was under construction, so I had to take a back road through a wooded area. There weren't any streetlights, and the only thing illuminating the road ahead was my high beams cutting through the dense fog. About 10 minutes in, I noticed a small wooden sign on the side of the road. It was tilted, covered in moss, but I could still make out the words. "Detour ahead." I slowed down, following the arrow pointing to a narrow dirt path. It didn't look like an official detour, but there wasn't anywhere else to go. As I drove, the road became rougher, with potholes and tree branches scraping against my car. I kept checking my phone for directions, but I had no signal. I was getting more and more uneasy when I saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like headlights. Relieved, I sped up a bit, hoping to catch up to another vehicle. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't headlights. It was a lantern swinging side to side, held by a man walking down the middle of the road. I slowed down to a crawl, my stomach knotting up. He wasn't moving out of the way. He just stood there staring at my car as I came to a stop. He was tall, wearing tattered clothes that looked soaked from the misty air. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. I rolled down my window just a crack and called out, "Do you need help?" He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. I was about to drive around him when he raised his hand and pointed to the woods on my left. I don't know why, but something about that gesture made my skin crawl. It was too deliberate, too slow. I shook my head and said, "I'm sorry. I can't help you." That's when he stepped closer. Panicking, I rolled up my window and shifted into reverse, ready to back up. But as soon as I looked in my rearview mirror, my heart stopped. There was another figure standing right behind my car. This one was smaller, hunched over, and holding something long, a stick, maybe, or a pole, I couldn't tell. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, unsure of what to do. Then the man with the lantern tapped on my window. It wasn't a hard knock, just a soft, rhythmic tapping. I turned to look at him, and he leaned down, bringing his face level with mine. His eyes, they were wrong. They didn't reflect the light from the lantern. They were just dark, empty sockets. I screamed, slamming the gas pedal, not caring if I hit the person behind me. My car jolted forward as the engine roared, and I swerved wildly to avoid the man with the lantern. I could hear something hit the side of my car, but I didn't stop to check. I sped down the dirt road, heart pounding, until I finally saw a highway sign in the distance. My phone buzzed as it regained signal, and I called the police, telling them everything. When they arrived, they found nothing. No signs, no lantern, no figures. The officer said the road I described didn't even exist on their maps. I drove the same route the next day in daylight, but the detour sign and dirt path were gone. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I'll never forget those empty eyes and the sound of that rhythmic tapping on my window. I live in a small rental house with my roommate, Rachel. We've been splitting rent for over a year now, and for the most part, it's been quiet and uneventful. This happened last November, as the days were getting shorter and colder. Rachel had a work conference in another state, so she'd be gone from Tuesday to Friday. I couldn't go with her, obviously, since I had to stay behind for my job. She left early Tuesday morning, and I settled into a routine of work and evenings, alone, at home. That first night, I was curled up on the couch watching a movie when I heard a faint knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I checked the peephole before opening it. It was a woman, maybe in her late 30s, wearing a long coat and holding a notebook. Her face was pale, and she seemed a little nervous. "Hi, can I help you?" I asked, cracking the door just slightly. She gave me a small smile. "I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to ask if you've seen a black cat around. My cat's been missing for a couple of days, and I thought I'd check the neighborhood." I told her I hadn't seen any cats but would keep an eye out. She thanked me and handed me a flyer with a picture of the cat before leaving. It seemed innocent enough, but something about her demeanor unsettled me. The next evening, after getting home from work, I noticed the same woman standing across the street looking toward my house. She wasn't holding her notebook or any flyers this time. She just stood there, staring. I watched her for a while through the blinds, and eventually she walked away, disappearing down the street. By Thursday, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. While cooking dinner that night, I thought I heard faint footsteps on the porch. I rushed to the window, but no one was there. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but I felt paranoid, constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows. Around 11 p.m., I was getting ready for bed when I heard a soft tapping at the kitchen window. My stomach dropped. The blinds were drawn, but the tapping continued slow and deliberate. I turned off the lights and stood frozen in the hallway, heart pounding. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. I waited in silence, trying to listen for any other sounds, but it was quiet. I finally worked up the courage to peek outside. The yard was empty, but the flyer the woman had given me was taped to the window. That night, I barely slept. Friday morning, I woke up to find muddy footprints leading up to my front door. They weren't there the night before, and it hadn't rained recently, which made it even stranger. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Rachel returned that evening, and I told her everything. She was just as freaked out as I was. We considered calling the police, but since nothing concrete had happened, we figured they wouldn't do much. That night, we both stayed up late, watching TV together in the living room. Around midnight, there was a sudden loud bang on the back door. We jumped up, and Rachel grabbed a kitchen knife while I called 911. The banging continued, louder and more frantic, as a voice called out, "Please let me in. I'm hurt. I need help." The voice was muffled, but sounded vaguely familiar. It was the woman. We stayed silent, hoping she would go away, but she didn't. Instead, she began pounding harder, shouting and pleading. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The police arrived about 10 minutes later and searched the area, but there was no sign of her. They took a report, but admitted there wasn't much they could do unless she returned. To this day, I have no idea what that woman wanted or why she targeted our house. We never saw her again, but the memory of that week still gives me chills. I've since installed cameras around the house, and Rachel and I double-check the locks every night. Some people might say she was just looking for her cat, but I know better. There was something very wrong with her. It was just after 1:30 a.m. when I stumbled back to my apartment after a night out with friends. I wasn't blackout drunk, but I'd had enough to feel disoriented and sluggish. The air was cold, and the streets were eerily quiet as I fumbled with the keypad to unlock the front door of my building. My fingers were clumsy, and it took longer than usual. But eventually, I made it inside and dragged myself up the stairs to my unit. The moment I stepped through the door, I tossed my jacket and keys onto the floor and collapsed onto the couch. My head was buzzing, and a faint nausea was starting to creep in, so I stayed still, staring at the dark ceiling and hoping it would pass. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is the sound of a faint knock on the door. It was soft at first, almost polite, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I checked my phone. 2:04 a.m. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was someone at the wrong door, or maybe it was just one of the neighbors messing around. But the knocking didn't stop. It turned into pounding. Reluctantly, I got up, shuffled toward the peephole, and squinted through it. The hallway light was dim, but I could make out a tall figure standing unnervingly still, their face obscured by the hood of a jacket. They weren't moving, just standing there, hand raised mid-knock like they were waiting for me to respond. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice wavering more than I liked. No response. They just stood there. A creeping unease began to settle over me, and I instinctively checked the deadbolt. Locked. I took a step back, trying to decide what to do next, when I heard something that sent a chill straight through me. A faint tapping sound coming from the balcony door on the opposite side of the apartment. My blood ran cold. I lived on the 3rd floor, and there was no fire escape. No one should be out there. Slowly, I turned toward the balcony. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faintest silhouette of movement behind them. Someone, or something, was out there. The pounding on the front door grew louder, more frantic, as the tapping on the glass became scratching, like nails dragging against the surface. My breath hitched. I didn't know what to do. My phone was still on the couch, out of reach, and I couldn't bring myself to move. Suddenly, the pounding on the front door stopped. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. A low, deliberate creak echoed from the hallway as though someone was turning the handle, testing it. But the door was locked, wasn't it? I was sure I'd locked it. The scratching on the balcony door turned into a sharp, deliberate knock. Whatever was out there was no longer trying to be subtle. My heart was hammering so loudly I thought it might burst. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Then everything stopped. The knocking, the scratching, the creaking, silence. For a moment I thought maybe they'd given up and left, but the relief was short-lived. From the corner of my eye I saw movement, a shadow slipping past the crack at the bottom of the front door, moving toward the living room window. I darted to the couch, grabbing my phone with trembling hands and dialing 911. As I explained the situation to the operator, I heard the faint sound of the balcony door sliding open. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't even realized it was unlocked. The operator's voice urged me to stay calm and hide, but before I could move, a cold draft swept through the apartment. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel it, the presence, standing behind me watching. "Hello," a voice whispered, low and raspy, far too close for comfort. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the open balcony door, curtains swaying in the wind. My phone slipped from my hand as I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks until it finally gave way. I ran into the hallway, slamming the door behind me and not stopping until I was outside, surrounded by streetlights and the faint hum of the city. When the police arrived, they found the balcony door wide open, but no signs of forced entry and nothing stolen. The only thing they noticed was a single handprint on the glass, too large to belong to anyone I knew. It was a quiet evening, and I was home alone with my cat, Felix. After a long day at work, I was looking forward to unwinding with a book and a cup of tea. Felix was curled up on the armrest of the couch, purring softly as I flipped through the pages. Around 9:30, Felix perked up suddenly, his ears twitching. He jumped off the couch and padded toward the kitchen, his tail low and movements cautious. I didn't think much of it. Cats are always curious about the smallest noises. A few minutes passed, and I realized Felix hadn't come back. "Felix," I called out, but there was no response. Setting my book down, I got up to check on him. I found him sitting in the kitchen, staring intently at the pantry door. His fur was puffed up, and he let out a low growl, a sound I'd never heard from him before. My first thought was that a mouse had gotten in, so I grabbed a broom and slowly opened the pantry. It was empty. Felix hissed and backed away, his gaze still fixed on the open pantry. I waved the broom around inside, but there was nothing there. "Come on, Felix. It's just your imagination," I muttered, closing the door. But he didn't follow me back to the living room. Instead, he sat in the hallway staring at the pantry door completely still. The unease started to creep in, but I shook it off. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on my book, though my eyes kept flicking toward Felix in the hallway. At around 11, I decided to call it a night. Felix finally moved from his spot and followed me upstairs to the bedroom. He curled up at the foot of the bed, and I left the door cracked open, as always. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound like soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart raced as I strained to listen. It was coming from downstairs. I reached over to turn on my bedside lamp, but the bulb flickered and died. Great, I muttered under my breath. I grabbed my phone for light and noticed Felix wasn't on the bed anymore. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. My gut told me to stay put, but I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that something was very wrong. I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down, shining my phone's flashlight into the dark living room. There was nothing there. But then I saw movement in the kitchen. My breath hitched as I saw the pantry door slowly swinging open. "Felix," I whispered, my voice trembling. And then I saw him sitting just outside the pantry, staring at something inside. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide and glowing in the dim light. I was frozen, torn between going down to grab him and staying put. That's when I noticed something else, a faint shadow moving inside the pantry. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadow froze, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then, a low, guttural whisper came from inside. "Leave." I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted down the stairs, scooped up Felix, and ran out the front door, not stopping until I was at my neighbor's house. The police came and searched the house. They found no one, but the pantry door was hanging off its hinges, as if it had been forced open from the inside. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that pantry. Felix still refuses to go near it, and I've started locking it every night. But sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear faint tapping, like something waiting to be let out. This is a story I've hesitated to share for a long time, because it still gives me chills when I think about it. It happened 3 years ago when my partner and I moved into a small, rural town. We wanted to escape the hustle of city life and find a quiet place to raise our daughter. The house we found was perfect, or so we thought. It was an old colonial-style home with charm and character. The best part, it came at a price we couldn't resist. The previous owners had moved out abruptly, which should have been a red flag, but we were too thrilled about the space to care. The first few weeks were uneventful. We spent our days unpacking and exploring the property, which included a small patch of woods in the backyard. Our daughter, Lily, loved it and spent hours playing near the tree line. One evening, while putting Lily to bed, she told me something odd. She said she didn't like the man in the woods. My heart skipped a beat. I asked her what she meant, and she said he was tall and quiet with a big hat, and that he watched her while she played. She said it so matter-of-factly that I didn't know how to respond. I told myself she was just imagining things. Kids do that, right? Still, I kept an eye on her whenever she played outside. A week later, I started noticing things out of place. The back gate, which I always kept closed, would be wide open in the morning. Tools from the shed would be scattered in the yard. I even found muddy footprints leading up to the back porch one morning. I told my partner, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably animals or some kids from the area messing around. I wanted to believe that, but deep down I wasn't so sure. One night, as I was locking up before bed, I heard a faint sound coming from the backyard. It was a low, rhythmic tapping. I looked out the window, but the yard was pitch black, save for the faint moonlight. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The sound stopped as soon as I opened the door. My heart was pounding as I shone the light around. Nothing. I felt silly for being so jumpy and went back inside. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tied to the handle of the back gate was a small bundle of sticks, twisted together with string. It looked like some kind of crude charm or marker. My partner dismissed it as a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant as a warning. That night, I heard the tapping again, louder this time. I stayed inside and peeked through the curtains, my breath caught in my throat. Standing at the edge of the woods was a figure. He was tall, just like Lily had said, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned hat. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the house. I woke my partner, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone. We called the police the next day. They did a sweep of the property, but found nothing. They said it was probably a drifter or a neighbor playing a prank. but the way they said it felt dismissive, like they didn't believe us. They suggested installing motion lights or cameras. We didn't have the budget for cameras, so we settled for the lights. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. Then, one evening, while doing dishes, I glanced out the kitchen window and saw something that made my stomach drop. The motion light at the edge of the woods flickered on. I froze, staring into the darkness. And then, slowly, the figure stepped into the light. This time, he wasn't alone. Two more figures emerged from the shadows, all dressed in the same dark, old-fashioned clothing. They stood there unmoving, watching the house. I screamed for my partner, who grabbed a baseball bat and stormed outside, yelling threats. The figures didn't move. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they turned and disappeared into the woods. The police came again and did another sweep. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. That was the last straw. We borrowed money from family and installed cameras. For weeks, we anxiously watched the footage, but nothing unusual happened. We started to relax, thinking maybe the cameras had scared them off. But then, one morning, we found a chilling message scratched into the wood of the back door. "We see you." We packed our things and left that same day. We sold the house at a loss and moved back to the city. To this day, we have no idea who those figures were or what they wanted. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think about that message and wonder, are they still watching? My husband James and I recently moved into a small, picturesque town in Oregon. We'd been wanting to escape the constant noise of the city, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to start fresh. James is a freelance writer, so he can work from anywhere, and I manage an online art shop. It was an easy transition for us. The house we chose was charming, but old. An early 1900s craftsman with creaky floorboards and beautiful stained glass windows. It had character, and we both loved it. The property sat at the edge of a dense forest, far enough away from neighbors to give us the peace and quiet we were craving. We'd been there for about a month when James noticed something strange. He often worked late into the night, and one evening he came into our bedroom looking pale. He said he'd heard someone walking around outside near his office window. He assumed it was a deer or some other animal at first. But then he heard what sounded like faint whispering. I dismissed it, teasing him about spending too much time writing creepy stories. But then I started noticing things too. Objects would go missing from the kitchen, a spoon, a mug, and reappear in odd places like the backyard or under the stairs. Once, I found my paintbrushes scattered across the floor, although I was certain I had packed them neatly in my studio. Then there was the attic. We'd only been up there once to store some old boxes, but one evening I heard muffled thuds coming from above our bedroom. James thought it might be squirrels, but when we checked, the attic was empty. Still, the noises continued. A week later, things escalated. One night I woke up to the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor above us. James and I both froze. Listening, the dragging sound stopped, replaced by what sounded like faint humming. The next morning, we decided to check the attic again. James pulled down the creaky ladder and we both climbed up, flashlight in hand. At first, everything seemed normal. Dusty boxes, cobwebs, and old furniture left by the previous owners. But then, tucked in the far corner of the attic, we found something chilling. There was a small wooden door set into the wall, barely noticeable behind some old trunks. It was too small for a grown person to fit through, but it had a rusted metal latch that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. My heart raced as James reached out to open it. Inside, we found a narrow crawl space filled with strange items. A stack of faded Polaroid photos, a broken music box, and a small porcelain doll with a cracked face. But the photos were the worst. They were all of our house, taken from different angles, some outside, some inside. One of them was of me, sitting at the kitchen table, completely unaware. We called the police, who searched the house and property but found no signs of a break-in or anyone living there. They said the items in the crawl space were probably left behind by the previous owners. That explanation didn't sit right with me, but I wanted to believe it. For a while, things seemed to settle down. The noises stopped and nothing else went missing, but last night it happened again. James and I were watching TV when we heard the sound of the back door creaking open. I was certain we had locked it, but when James went to check, the door was ajar and the lock was scratched as if someone had forced it open. We called the police again, but by the time they arrived, whoever it was had disappeared into the woods. Now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. James is convinced we should sell the house and leave, but something about this place keeps pulling me back. Maybe it's curiosity, or maybe it's fear. Either way, I don't know how much longer we can stay here. And then just now, as I finished typing this, I heard it again, that faint humming drifting down from the attic. I recently had a chilling experience that reminded me how unpredictable life can be, even in the most ordinary situations. It happened while I was house sitting for a family friend who had gone out of town. They had a quiet home on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by woods. I thought it would be a peaceful getaway. Just me, the house, and their dog, Max. Max was an older German shepherd who spent most of his time napping in the living room. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I spent my time reading, catching up on shows, and taking Max for evening walks along the edge of the property. The house felt safe, secluded, but cozy. That all changed on the third night. It started around 10 p.m. I was curled up on the couch watching TV when Max suddenly perked up, his ears rigid. He let out a low growl and stared at the front window. I muted the TV, straining to hear whatever had spooked him. At first, there was nothing. Then faintly, I heard what sounded like someone walking along the gravel path leading to the house. I stood up and moved toward the window, careful to stay out of sight. My heart raced as I peeked through the curtain. The yard was empty, bathed in pale moonlight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a stray dog or a raccoon, and went back to the couch. Max, however, remained uneasy. 15 minutes later, there was a sharp knock at the back door. I froze. Nobody had any reason to come to the house this late, especially at the back entrance. Max barked furiously, his hackles raised. I grabbed my phone and slowly made my way to the kitchen, staying in the shadows. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound confident but failing miserably. There was no response, just silence and the heavy thumping of my heart. I turned on the porch light and carefully peeked out. Again, there was nothing. The yard was empty and the trees beyond stood still in the windless night. I locked the door, double-checking the deadbolt, and tried to convince myself it was just some kids playing a prank. But as I turned to head back to the living room, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping past the window. Someone was definitely outside. I grabbed Max's leash and the baseball bat my friend kept by the back door. "Stay with me, buddy," I whispered to the dog as we crept toward the front window. Peering out cautiously, I caught a glimpse of a figure darting behind a tree. My stomach dropped. This was no prank. I dialed 911, whispering my situation to the operator. They assured me officers were on their way and instructed me to stay inside with the doors locked. But then I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on the front door, followed by a voice calling my name. "Hey, it's okay. You can let me in." The voice was too familiar, my friend's voice, but distorted wrong somehow. They weren't supposed to be home for days. I tightened my grip on the bat. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, hoping to sound braver than I felt. "You already did," the voice said, eerily calm. "But they're not going to help you." Max barked again, louder this time, as the knocking grew more insistent. The dog pressed against my leg as if sensing my rising panic. Suddenly, there was a loud bang as the doorknob rattled violently. Whoever was out there was trying to break in. Seconds stretched into eternity before I finally saw flashing blue lights through the window. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, and the knocking stopped abruptly. Whoever it was, they were gone by the time officers arrived. They searched the property but found no trace of the intruder. Even now, I replay that night over and over, wondering what might have happened if the police hadn't come when they did, or if I hadn't brought Max along for protection. The strangest part, my friends swore they never told anyone I was house-sitting. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there, but I still hear that voice in my nightmares. I was 19 the summer I stayed alone at my grandparents' old farmhouse while they traveled out of state. The house sat deep in the woods, down a gravel road that twisted through miles of dense trees before finally meeting the main highway. It was peaceful, or so I thought at first. No neighbors within sight, just an old barn and endless woods stretching to the horizon. One afternoon, I drove to the only gas station within 10 miles. While filling my tank, a beat-up gray pickup pulled up to the next pump. The driver, a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and scruffy beard, stepped out and nodded at me. "Nice day out," he said casually. "Yeah, sure is," I replied, polite but keeping my distance. He leaned against his truck and watched as I finished up. "You from around here?" he asked. His voice was calm, but something about the way his eyes didn't blink unsettled me. "I'm just staying for the summer," I said vaguely, hoping to end the conversation. "Nice place." "Quiet," he added before turning back to his truck. "See you around." I didn't think much of it at first, but something about the encounter stayed with me. I shrugged it off, drove back to the house, and carried on with my day. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something strange, faint, rhythmic tapping on the side of the house. I sat up and listened carefully. It sounded too deliberate to be a tree branch brushing against the wall. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to sleep. The next morning, I found nothing unusual outside. No marks on the house, no signs of anything suspicious. By the time night fell again, I'd almost forgotten about it. But as soon as I turned off the lights, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. This time, it was followed by a faint whisper, "Come outside." Every hair on my body stood on end. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, Josh. "Someone's messing with me," I whispered. "I think they're outside the house." "Lock the doors," Josh said immediately. "I'll head over." I checked every window and door before waiting anxiously in the living room, heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, headlights cut through the dark as Josh's truck pulled into the driveway. I ran outside to meet him, grateful for the company. We searched the perimeter with flashlights but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to explain the sounds or whispers. Josh tried to reassure me it was probably just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. The next few nights were eerily quiet. I started to think maybe Josh was right, and I was just paranoid. Until the fifth night. It was just after midnight when I woke up to heavy footsteps on the front porch. I froze in bed, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the sound of someone jiggling the doorknob. My blood turned cold. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911 and whispered my location to the operator. "Someone's trying to get into the house," I said, my voice shaking. "Stay inside and stay on the line," she instructed. "Officers are on their way." I crouched behind the couch, clutching a fireplace poker as the intruder circled the house, tapping on windows and whispering my name. My real name, which I hadn't told anyone in town. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was gone. They searched the property but found no one, only a set of muddy boot prints leading back into the woods. The officers told me to stay vigilant and call again if anything happened. The next day, I packed my bags and left the farmhouse, refusing to stay another night alone. To this day, I don't know who that man was or how he knew my name, but I'm certain of one thing. He wanted me to come outside, and if I had, I don't think I would have come back. I was 19 when I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, just far enough from the busy streets to be quiet, but close enough that I could walk to the grocery store. It was a typical one-bedroom place with old hardwood floors and peeling wallpaper, but it was affordable. Perfect for someone starting out on their own. At first, everything seemed normal. The neighbors were quiet, and the sound of traffic never reached my door. But after a week of living there, strange things started happening. It started with the noise. Every night around 2 a.m., I'd hear a soft thumping sound coming from the apartment above mine. It wasn't loud, but it was consistent. A slow, rhythmic thud, almost like someone was pacing back and forth or dragging something heavy. I figured it was just the neighbors. But it happened every night without fail, and it made me uneasy. Then I noticed something even stranger. My door would be slightly open when I came home. Not wide open, but just a crack, as if someone had been inside. I couldn't remember leaving it open, and I always double-checked before leaving the apartment. The first few times I brushed it off. Maybe I was forgetful, or just imagined it, but it kept happening. One evening, I decided to stay up and figure out what was going on. I locked the door and stayed near the peephole, waiting to see if anyone would come and go. Around midnight, I saw a figure through the hallway window, standing in front of my door. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, then turned and slowly walked down the hallway. It was too dark to make out any details, but something about the movement felt off. The next morning, I decided to speak with the building manager. He was an older man, quiet and reserved, but when I mentioned the sounds and the door being opened, his expression changed. He told me that the apartment upstairs had been vacant for months and no one had moved in. "I haven't had any complaints from your neighbors in a while," he said, his voice lowering. "But if you keep hearing things, you might want to have someone take a look. Maybe there's an animal or something in the walls." I didn't believe it, but I thanked him and went back to my apartment, feeling more unnerved than before. That night, I stayed in, determined to get some sleep despite the anxiety bubbling up inside me. Around 2 a.m., the thumping started again. It was so clear now, like someone was pacing directly above me, right in the middle of my apartment, the same rhythmic dragging noise. My heart started to race. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and went outside to walk around the building to see if I could find any clues. I reached the back of the building and saw a small, narrow window at the top of the stairs leading up to the second floor. It was open slightly and the sound of thumping was louder now. I didn't know why I did it, but I climbed up and peeked inside. There, in the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A man was sitting in the middle of the room, rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. The room was completely empty except for him and a pile of old, decaying furniture. I gasped and pulled back quickly, but before I could react, the man's head snapped up, and I swear he looked directly at me through the window. His eyes were wide and vacant, and he smiled, slowly, creepily, as if he knew exactly who I was. I ran back to my apartment and locked the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and when I woke up in the morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night in that place. I called the building manager and told him I needed to move out immediately. When he came by to help me pack up, I asked him about the man in the apartment above. He seemed confused, but when he went to check, he came back with an odd look on his face. "There's no one living up there," he said quietly. "That apartment's been locked for months. It's been empty since the last tenant passed away." I didn't stay to ask any more questions. I moved out that same day, and I've never returned to that building. To this day, I can't shake the image of that man's twisted smile, and I wonder if I was really alone all that time. I was 22 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend the weekend in an old family cabin my uncle owned, tucked away in the mountains. It was a quiet place, isolated, far from the nearest town. I'd been there before, but this time, I was alone. My uncle had offered it to me when I mentioned needing some time away from work, and I figured it'd be the perfect escape. The first night was peaceful enough. I made myself comfortable, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of nature surrounding the cabin. It was so quiet, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I spent the evening reading a book by the fireplace, and when the light faded, I went to bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, a low creaking noise, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor above me. The cabin only had one floor, so I froze, trying to rationalize the sound. Maybe it was the wind moving the house. I lay in bed, listening intently. It came again, thud, scrape, thud. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing and tried to sleep, but the sound persisted. It wasn't a gust of wind or an animal. It was deliberate, almost rhythmic. It came from upstairs. The attic, to be precise. I finally mustered the courage to get out of bed. As I walked upstairs, I noticed that the attic door was slightly ajar, something that had never happened when I was there before. I reached the top and slowly pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic was pitch dark, except for the faint light coming through the small window at the far end. I stepped inside, looking around, but saw nothing unusual. Then I heard it again, a scraping sound, this time coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the empty space of the attic. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't feel right. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing. That's when I saw it written on the wall in what appeared to be old, faded chalk. "Get out." My mind went blank. The handwriting looked too deliberate, too personal. It was as though someone had been here recently, waiting for me. I didn't even think. I ran back downstairs and out of the cabin, barely even stopping to grab my things. My heart was pounding in my ears as I threw my belongings into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped off without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I called my uncle. I didn't want to tell him what happened. He would think I was just spooked. So, I made up an excuse about the power being out and how I didn't feel comfortable being alone. He didn't press the matter, but I could tell he thought I was being dramatic. It wasn't until a few months later, when I visited again, that I found something that shook me to my core. My uncle was cleaning out the attic, and when I went to check on him, I saw the wall. The same spot where I had seen the message. Only this time, the writing was gone, as though it had never been there. I asked him if he'd ever seen it before, and he just looked at me with confusion. No, he said, there's nothing on that wall, but I knew what I had seen. I was 23 when I decided to take a solo trip to a remote cabin I'd rented for the weekend. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway from the stresses of city life, located deep in the woods near a small, forgotten town. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected, with winding roads and barely any signs of civilization for miles. When I finally arrived, the place was beautiful, rustic and charming, with a large stone fireplace and big windows that looked out onto the forest. It felt peaceful, and for the first time in weeks, I was able to relax. The first evening went by without incident. I made dinner, lit a fire, and enjoyed the solitude, reading a book until I finally went to bed. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something faint tapping at the window. I thought it was just the wind or a tree branch, but the tapping persisted. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head and closing my eyes. It wasn't until I heard a whisper, barely audible through the walls, that I froze. "Are you awake?" I shot up in bed, heart racing. The house was completely empty. At least I thought it was. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains, but there was nothing outside, just the dark expanse of the woods. I chalked it up to my imagination and tried to fall back asleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint whisper again, as if it was just on the edge of my hearing. It didn't stop until I finally passed out from exhaustion. The next day, I tried to go about my normal routine. I went for a walk around the property and explored the surrounding woods, trying to clear my mind. But the strange feeling of being watched lingered, and the whispering grew louder as the evening approached. That night, things escalated. I was cooking dinner in the kitchen when I heard someone on the porch, a soft scraping sound, as if someone was dragging their feet along the wood. I figured it was just an animal, but then I heard it again, louder this time. I rushed to the door and opened it, but there was nothing there. Confused and more than a little unsettled, I stepped outside and looked around. That's when I saw it, a small, handwritten note stuck to the door. It read, "You're not alone." My breath caught in my throat. I quickly scanned the area, but saw no one in sight. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been watching me this entire time, I went inside, locked all the doors, and called my best friend, telling him everything. He urged me to leave, but I didn't want to be overdramatic. I stayed up all night, my eyes constantly scanning the windows, waiting for any sign of movement. The whispers returned, louder this time and closer. I felt something brush against the back of my neck and spun around, only to find the room empty. The following morning, I packed my bags, still shaking from the night before. I checked the cameras I had set up around the cabin, but when I reviewed the footage, I saw nothing unusual, just me, pacing in the living room, looking paranoid. But as I scrolled to the final clip, taken just a few minutes before I left the cabin, my stomach dropped. In the corner of the frame, standing just outside the door, was a figure, pale and thin, barely visible, but unmistakable. They were watching me. I couldn't leave the cabin fast enough, and I didn't stop until I was back in the city. To this day, I don't know who or what was there with me that weekend, but I do know I never went back to that cabin. I was 21 and had just moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a little two-bedroom place surrounded by overgrown fields and dense trees in the back. The landlord lived out of state, and the neighbors were far enough away that I rarely saw them. The first few nights were peaceful, with only the occasional rustle of wind through the tall grass or chirp of crickets to break the quiet. But by the end of my first week, strange things began to happen. It started small, knocking sounds in the middle of the night, always around the same time, but never loud enough to seem threatening. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling or an animal brushing against the siding. I told myself not to be paranoid. Then one evening, while I was reading on the couch, I heard a distinct noise, a soft scrape against the front window. My heart skipped a beat, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I locked the door, trying to shake off the uneasiness, and went to bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a faint tapping sound at the back door. It was soft but persistent. I froze, listening carefully. I didn't have any pets, and there was no reason for anyone to be outside. Gathering my courage, I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. Nothing but darkness and the swaying silhouette of trees. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt just outside the back door. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh either. It looked as though someone had stood there for quite some time, pacing back and forth before eventually walking off into the woods. That night, I triple-checked the locks and windows, determined to stay alert. Just as I was starting to feel a bit more secure, my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. Nice place. Cozy. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. No one should have had my number except close friends and family. I typed back quickly, "Who is this?" but no response came. The following night, the knocks returned, louder this time. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then my phone buzzed again. "Are you alone?" My hands shook as I blocked the number and called the police. 2 officers arrived and did a sweep of the property but found nothing unusual. They assured me it was probably just a prank and left, but I knew better. Someone was watching. The next day, I bought security cameras and set them up around the house. I wanted proof if this person came back. That night, everything was silent. No knocks, no taps, no texts. I started to think maybe they had finally gotten bored and moved on, until I checked the footage the next morning. Around 2:45 a.m., the camera by the back door caught movement, a figure dressed in dark clothing, standing just out of the light. They stood completely still, facing the door, before slowly turning to look directly into the camera. Even now, I can still remember the way they raised a hand and pressed a single finger to their lips. I moved out the following week, breaking the lease and never looking back. To this day, I have no idea who that person was or why they were there. But I know one thing, I was never truly alone in that house. I was 20 when I agreed to house sit for my aunt and uncle while they went on a 2-week vacation. Their place was a beautiful but isolated cabin at the edge of a lake, with woods surrounding it on all sides. The nearest neighbor was nearly a mile down the dirt road, and cell service was spotty at best. At first, I thought it would be a peaceful getaway, just me, the lake, and a couple of good books. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time kayaking, reading on the deck, and soaking in the quiet. But by the 4th night, that tranquility turned into unease. It started with noises, faint rustling sounds coming from the woods. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons or deer maybe, but the sounds didn't stop. Around midnight, I heard something heavier than any small animal thudding around outside, followed by what sounded like whispering. I turned off all the lights and peered out the window. Moonlight illuminated the clearing around the cabin, but I didn't see anything unusual. Still, I locked all the doors and windows, my heart pounding. The next morning, I brushed it off. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. After all, I was a city kid, not used to the eerie quiet of the woods. That evening, I was sitting by the fire when I noticed something strange. The wind chimes my aunt had hung on the porch were perfectly still despite a light breeze. They swayed gently, but no sound came from them, as if something had silenced them. I shook my head and laughed nervously. "I'm losing it," I muttered to myself. But then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Every hair on my body stood up. No one should have been out there, not this far from town, not at that hour. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing but the empty porch. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. Silence answered me. I locked the door and retreated to the kitchen, trying to calm myself. But then came another knock, this time from the back door. Heart racing, I grabbed a knife from the counter and forced myself to look outside. Again, there was nothing there, just the woods and the lake shimmering faintly in the moonlight. By now, I was done trying to rationalize things. I locked myself in the bedroom, barricaded the door with a chair, and sat awake until dawn, listening for more sounds. The next day, I called my aunt and uncle. "Everything's fine," I lied, not wanting to worry them. But as soon as the call ended, I packed my things and decided I'd sleep in my car if I had to. That night, just as I was about to leave, I heard it again, whispering right outside the cabin window. It was close, too close. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to look, but what I saw made my blood freeze. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, its face obscured by shadow, but I could tell it was watching me. And then it did something I will never forget. It raised a hand and slowly waved. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for my car, locked the doors, and sped down that dirt road without looking back. The next day, I returned only to grab the rest of my things, accompanied by a friend. There was no sign of anyone near the cabin, no footprints, no disturbances, just eerie silence. I never told my aunt and uncle what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Something was out there that night, and it was watching. About a year ago, I decided to rent a remote cabin in the mountains for a weekend getaway. I needed some time away from the noise of the city and thought a weekend of solitude would be perfect. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend and had no Wi-Fi or cell service, exactly what I thought I needed at the time. When I arrived, the place was picturesque. A small wooden cabin surrounded by towering pines, with a crystal clear lake just a short walk away. It was peaceful and quiet, exactly what I wanted. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire, made dinner, and read a book by lantern light until I drifted off to sleep. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But the next night, things took a strange turn. Around midnight, I woke up to an odd tapping sound coming from the front porch. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and persistent. My first thought was that it must be a branch knocking against the side of the cabin. Still groggy, I pulled on my jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside to check. The cold night air bit at my skin, and the silence was almost oppressive. I scanned the porch, but there were no branches in sight, nothing that could have made the sound. Just the empty darkness and the tall trees silhouetted against the sky. I shook it off as my imagination and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But just as I settled back into bed, the tapping started again, this time louder, sharper. It was coming from the back of the cabin now, near the kitchen window. My stomach clenched. I hadn't seen any animals nearby, and it didn't sound like an animal anyway. It was too measured, too intentional. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity and a creeping sense of dread got the better of me. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I walked to the kitchen and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just the dark forest stretching endlessly into the night. I turned off the flashlight and stood in the dim glow of the lantern, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I saw it. A handprint on the outside of the window pane. It wasn't smudged or faded. It was fresh, the fingers long and thin, pressed firmly against the glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward. There had been no one there. No one I saw anyway. And that print hadn't been there earlier. The tapping resumed, louder now, moving rapidly from one window to the next around the cabin, as if whatever it was circled the building, searching for a way in. I locked every door and window, my hands trembling. The sound continued, relentless, echoing through the empty cabin. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. Silence blanketed the cabin once again. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for it to start up again, but it never did. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The handprint was gone, and the snow outside showed no footprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been there at all. I packed up and left the cabin that afternoon, cutting my weekend short. I told my friend what happened, hoping he'd laugh it off and say it was just my imagination. Instead, his face went pale. "That cabin used to belong to my uncle," he said quietly. He swore up and down it was haunted, but no one believed him. Said he'd hear tapping at night and find handprints on the windows too. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. Last winter, I was hired to house sit for a family friend named Mrs. Harper while she traveled overseas for a month. Her house was a charming old Victorian on the edge of town, filled with antiques and creaky wooden floors. It felt cozy by day but unsettling by night, with shadows that stretched far too long and hallways that seemed quieter than they should. The first few nights were uneventful. I took care of her two cats, read by the fireplace, and enjoyed the solitude. It was peaceful until the fourth night. Around midnight, I was lying in bed reading when I heard a faint thud coming from downstairs. I assumed one of the cats had knocked something over, but when I got up to check, both cats were curled up together in the living room, sound asleep. Nothing appeared out of place, so I returned to bed, brushing it off as the old house settling. But not long after, the sound came again, louder this time. It was a distinct knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the house. I grabbed my phone and walked through the dark hallway toward the source of the noise. The knock continued steadily, guiding me like a beacon. It led me to the dining room, where I noticed something strange. The antique grandfather clock that stood against the far wall wasn't ticking. Mrs. Harper had told me the clock had been broken for years, more of a decorative piece than anything functional, but now the pendulum was moving, slow and deliberate. A cold chill ran down my spine. Before I could process what I was seeing, a soft voice echoed through the room. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. My throat tightened. It couldn't have been my imagination. I heard it as clearly as my own breath. The clock suddenly stopped ticking, and silence blanketed the house. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to check every room, making sure the house was secure. Nothing was out of place, no signs of anyone else being there. I barely slept that night, listening to every creak and whisper of the house. The next morning, I told myself it had been a combination of nerves and my imagination playing tricks on me. By evening, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous and resolved to finish out the job without letting fear get the better of me. But the final night I stayed there, something happened I can't explain. It was storming outside, rain hammering against the windows. The power flickered occasionally, plunging the house into momentary darkness. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but Milo, one of the cats, suddenly darted from the room, his fur bristling. A moment later, I heard it, soft footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. I stood frozen, unsure whether to call someone or investigate myself. My pulse raced as the footsteps grew louder, stopping directly above me in Mrs. Harper's room. Gripping a heavy metal flashlight, I forced myself up the creaky staircase and down the hall. The door to her room stood ajar, gently swaying in the draft. "Milo," I called, hoping it was just the cat somehow making all that noise. I stepped inside and swept the flashlight beam across the room. It was empty. Just the neatly made bed and heavy velvet curtains swaying slightly from the open window. Then I saw them, wet footprints on the hardwood floor leading from the window to the bed, where they simply stopped. No retreat, no sign of where whoever or whatever made them had gone. I didn't stay to figure it out. I grabbed my bag, scooped up the cats, and drove straight to my apartment, locking every door and window behind me. Mrs. Harper laughed it off when I told her. "This house has its quirks," she said with a smile. "It's just old wood and wild imagination. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, and no amount of reasoning will ever explain it." A few months ago, I agreed to house sit for my cousin Julia. She and her husband had recently moved into a large, old farmhouse on the edge of a quiet rural town. They were excited for a weekend getaway, and I figured a peaceful stay out in the countryside would be a nice change of pace. The first day was uneventful, just me, their dog Milo, and acres of fields stretching out to the horizon. The house creaked and groaned a bit, but I chalked it up to old wood and shifting foundations. That night, after taking Milo for a walk around the property, I locked up and settled into the living room to watch a movie. The only light came from the flickering TV, and Milo snoozed by my feet. Everything was calm, until I heard a faint tapping at the back door. At first, I ignored it. I told myself it was probably just a branch knocking against the house in the wind. But when the tapping came again, steady and deliberate, I muted the TV and strained to listen. Milo perked up, his ears twitching. I got up cautiously and moved toward the kitchen where the back door was. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached it. I peeked through the small window in the door but saw nothing unusual, just darkness beyond the porch light's glow. Figuring it was nothing, I double-checked the lock and returned to the couch. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The quiet of the house now felt oppressive, heavy with tension. Minutes later, Milo growled softly. His gaze was fixed on the hallway leading to the front of the house. My pulse quickened. "What's up, buddy?" I whispered, my voice wavering. Then I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible footsteps moving down the hallway. They were slow and methodical, as if whoever it was wanted to stay hidden, but couldn't completely mask their presence. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed Julia. When she picked up, I tried to sound calm. "Hey, has anyone ever mentioned weird noises in the house?" "What do you mean?" she asked, sounding confused. I paused as the footsteps stopped, followed by a creak from upstairs. "I swear I heard someone walking." "The house does make noise sometimes," she said. "But if you're freaked out, call the cops. Better safe than sorry." I ended the call and tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe the house really was just settling. But when I heard another creak, closer this time, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I steeled myself and crept up the stairs, Milo at my side. Each step felt heavier than the last. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, lined with closed doors leading to the bedrooms and bathroom. I flicked on the flashlight and scanned the space. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of being watched prickled at my skin. Slowly, I pushed open each door, finding only empty rooms. When I reached the last door, Julia's bedroom, I hesitated. Milo let out a low growl as I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly. The beam of the flashlight swept across the room, revealing the neatly made bed and quiet shadows. Then I saw it, a smudged handprint on the inside of the window, as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass from outside. But we were on the second floor. There was no ledge, no balcony, nothing that would allow anyone to reach that window. My stomach twisted into knots. I stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked myself in the guest room with Milo and called the police, whispering everything I had seen. They arrived 20 minutes later and searched the house and grounds thoroughly, but found no signs of a break-in. They couldn't explain the handprint either. To this day, Julia insists no one else has ever experienced anything strange in that house, but I'll never forget the chilling realization that someone, or something, had been watching me from an impossible place. I've always been comfortable staying home alone. My apartment is on the top floor of an older, well-maintained building, and nothing unusual ever happens around here until that one strange night last spring. It was a Saturday evening, and my plans fell through last minute, so I decided to have a quiet night in. I made dinner, threw on a movie, and settled on the couch. The windows were open to let in the cool, spring air, and I could hear the occasional car passing by on the street below. Around 9 p.m., as the movie was nearing its climax, I heard what I thought was a knock on my door. It was faint, barely noticeable over the sound of the TV. I hit pause and listened closely. Silence. Figuring it was just my mind playing tricks, I shrugged it off and went back to the movie. But 10 minutes later, the knock came again, this time louder, more deliberate. My pulse quickened as I stood up and walked cautiously to the door. I peered through the peephole, but the hallway outside was empty. A chill ran down my spine. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor passing by had accidentally bumped into the door. I locked the deadbolt just to be safe and returned to the couch. Then I heard it again. Not a knock this time, but a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging something sharp along the doorframe. My breath caught in my throat. I muted the TV and listened as the scraping continued, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building's security desk. "Hey, this is apartment 3F, I said, keeping my voice steady. "Is there anyone hanging around the hallways tonight?" The security guard's voice crackled over the line. "No one's reported anything." "Want me to come up and check?" "Yeah, please," I said. While I waited, the scraping stopped. Silence stretched through the apartment, heavy and oppressive. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank or some weird maintenance issue, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. After what felt like forever, there was a knock at the door. "Security," a voice called. I rushed to open it, relief washing over me as the guard stepped inside. I checked the hall. "Nothing there," he said. "Maybe it was a pipe making noise or something." I nodded, though I didn't believe it. He lingered for a minute before heading back downstairs, and I locked the door behind him. Everything was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to call it a night and headed to my bedroom. That's when I heard it, the sound of my living room window sliding open. I froze in place. I hadn't closed the windows earlier, but they were on the third floor. No one should have been able to reach them, but now I was sure someone was inside. I backed into my bedroom, heart racing, and locked the door. Dialing 911, I whispered my situation to the operator, trying to stay calm. They assured me help was on the way. Minutes passed in tense silence until I heard faint footsteps moving through the apartment, coming closer to my bedroom door. The handle jiggled and I felt my chest tighten. I called the cops, I shouted, trying to sound brave. They're almost here. There was a pause, then soft laughter, low and unsettling. The footsteps retreated, and I heard the window slide shut again. When the police arrived, they searched the apartment and surrounding area but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the ground below the windows. They told me it was likely a prank or maybe my imagination, but I knew better. Someone or something had been there that night. And what haunts me most is that I never found out how they got in or where they went. I used to think of my neighborhood as quiet and safe. It wasn't the type of place where unusual things happened. Rows of tidy houses with well-kept lawns, neighbors who waved but mostly kept to themselves. It was as ordinary as could be. But one night last fall, everything changed. It was a Friday and I was home alone while my roommate, Chris, was out of town. The rain tapped gently against the windows as I curled up on the couch wrapped in a blanket, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. The only sound besides the rain was the occasional creak of the old house settling. Around 11 p.m., I heard a faint knock on the front door. It was subtle, almost hesitant, but it still made my pulse quicken. Nobody was supposed to be visiting, and all the lights were off, except for the one in the living room. I figured it was probably a delivery or a neighbor. Still, I hesitated before getting up to check. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing but the empty porch bathed in the glow of the porch light. No one was there. I told myself I was imagining things and went back to the couch. Then about 5 minutes later, I heard it again. Another knock, louder this time. My heart started to race. I looked through the peephole once more, and again, the porch was empty. Unease prickled at my skin. Maybe it was just a prank, I thought. Kids being weird on a rainy night. Trying to shake it off, I went back to my phone. But the next knock was harder, more insistent, followed by the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. My stomach twisted. I crept back to the door, careful to stay out of view, and listened closely. The footsteps paused, then moved around to the side of the house. I locked every door and window, my hands trembling. My logical side tried to reason it away, probably just some neighborhood kid, but a deeper instinct told me something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and called Chris. "Hey," I whispered when he answered. "You didn't have anyone coming by the house?" "No." "Why?" he asked, sounding groggy. "Someone keeps knocking. It's weird. They're gone when I check." "You sure it's not just your imagination?" "I'm not imagining footsteps," I said. Chris told me to call the police if it got worse, and I hung up, still unsettled. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, turning up the volume to drown out my nerves, but it didn't work. Minutes later, a loud thud came from the back door. This time I jumped up and sprinted to the kitchen window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see a dark figure standing by the back door, facing it as if they were waiting for me to open it. I froze, unable to breathe. The figure stood there motionless, hooded and unidentifiable in the dim light. After a few seconds, they stepped forward and knocked sharply on the glass. I backed away, phone in hand, and called 911. "There's someone outside my house," I told the operator, struggling to keep my voice steady. "They've been knocking and walking around for the past half hour." The operator assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay put. I locked myself in the bathroom, every sound amplified by my pounding heartbeat. Then, as if to mock my fear, I heard a voice, calm, almost conversational. "I know you're in there," it said from just outside the door. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a shout, just a casual statement delivered with eerie confidence. "I've already called the police," I shouted back, hoping to scare them off. There was silence for a long moment before the voice replied, "That's fine. They won't find me." Footsteps echoed down the porch, growing quieter until they faded completely. I stayed locked in the bathroom until the police arrived and searched the property. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the mud, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. But I know what I saw and heard. That voice still haunts me. To this day, I have no idea who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that after that night, I never felt quite as safe in my own home again.